1773, the Bostonians did something highly illegal, speaking of law and crime and punishment, that the British were more angry about than the deaths that occurred as a result of a thing called the Boston Massacre back in 1770. What was more of a concern to the British? Human life or private property?
Property.
You got it. And what private property was destroyed by Bostonians in December of 1773? Tea. Now, England's angry, so they passed a series of laws meant to punish Boston, mainly. They shut the port of Boston, they taxed them even more, etc., etc., etc. And so tensions are running high. These acts that the British passed were called the Coercive Acts, to force Boston to heed to the law. However, the Americans thought these acts were so intolerable, we called those same acts the what acts? The Intolerable Acts. How many people have heard of the Intolerable Acts? It's the same thing. They're acts to punish Boston by Parliament. Well, the Americans decide that, you know, things are going from bad to worse here. Maybe we should kind of get together with some of the other colonies, because the 13 colonies needed some kind of cohesion. A lot of the colonists up and down the colonies, like in Virginia and the Carolinas, are thinking, you know, if it could happen up in Massachusetts, it could happen to us too. So the communication really starts to take place, and they form a thing called the First Continental Congress. That's in 1774, and that's in response to the Intolerable Acts. Now, the First Continental Congress didn't accomplish anything except one thing. They said, let's meet again in the spring of 1775 if things don't get better. Well, we know what happens in the spring of 1775, this right here. In the meantime, the Americans start training their local militia. They will eventually start training them and call them Minutemen, so they're ready at a minute's notice, but that basically happens after the battle that happens here. As I said, there were really no Minutemen here, they were just militia. They start storing arms, and where they start storing arms is 15 miles outside of Boston in a place called Concord. 2 miles from here, we're going to be going out there. That is the British goal. On the night of April 18th, actually during the afternoon of April 18th, and George knows about this because he's the one that pointed out to me the last time we were here, thank you very much, George, my right-hand man. There's a place called the Green Dragon Tavern. We'll see it when we walk the Freedom Trail tomorrow, or on Saturday in Boston. At the Green Tavern, there were American spies listening to British officers as they're drinking. Of course, their mouths are opening up, and they're talking about how they're going to send British troops out here sometime in April to seize the American weapons that they're storing out here. The Americans are storing these weapons in case there's more trouble. The Americans hear about this, of course, with their spies. I think their little kids were in the tavern hearing this, and they told some of the American leaders, such as Dr. Joseph Warren, whose biography is online for you in D2L or in the book that we have. I'd like you to read about him, interesting guy. We'll see him again when we get to Bunker Hill on Saturday. The Americans now are starting to think, okay, the British are going to go out there and take those weapons. We better be ready. And so they are ready on the night of April 18th, 1775. But they aren't sure if the British are going to march through the neck of Boston, which was like a big peninsula at the time, it's since been filled in, and march out here to Concord, or if they're going to come across the Charles Harbor on boats. And so they put a watchman up in the tower of the Old North Church. We'll be going there, and you'll be able to, I don't know if you can go right up in the tower, but this is where he stood, and he was given the instructions that if you get word that the British are coming by land, marching down the neck of Boston, then hold up one lantern so they can be seen across the Charles Harbor, because we'll have riders over there. And one of the riders, not the only rider, there were dozens of them, one of them was a guy by the name of Paul Revere. Well, he ends up holding up 2 lanterns, which meant the British are going by sea. Now, where did the British start that day? They started in Boston Common. We're going to see that probably tomorrow, and we'll see it definitely on Saturday, because that's where we start the Freedom Trail tour. The British think that they're going to sneak out here to Concord, 15 miles away. The Americans know all about it, and the word is being spread. Paul Revere himself gets arrested at least twice that night by the British. He doesn't even make it all the way to Concord to warn the Americans. Another fellow by the name of William Dawes makes it even further than Paul Revere, but he also gets arrested. The guy that really deserves the credit is a 22-year-old doctor, believe it or not, a doctor at 22, by the name of William Prescott. He had been out on a hot date with his girlfriend out in Concord. And he's coming back later that night after this hot date. He runs into some of the American messengers. He says, oh, I'll help out. And he's the only one that really completed the ride. But they start warning the Americans throughout. Now the British get off the boats across the harbor. It takes them a long time. It's a mess. The British don't know what they're doing, getting in these boats. They have to make 2 or 3 trips. They drop them off in land that's swampland. The British soldiers are angry, and now they've got to march 15 miles out to Concord. Rumor is that they're coming, so the Americans now meet out here in the green in the dark. But no British. And so what do? They dismiss, and they go over here to Buckman Tavern, and as we said, they spend the night drinking. Some of the men will go to their homes, which are right around Green here. Now, I should have mentioned to you, a green in New England is like basically the center of town. It's like in Gettysburg, we have the circle, the square there. In Gettysburg, this is kind of the same thing, except it's much larger. But at the time, the houses of some of these guys that are going to get killed here are right around the green, and the wives and the children are watching this action because the British show up about 4:30 in the morning. The Americans now know the British are just outside of town, coming from that direction. They come rushing out of the tavern, out of the homes, and about 70 Americans meet out here in the green. There are 700 British on their way. 300 of them are going to head over here to the green to see what's going on because they can hear the drum roll of the Americans. This is 5 o'clock in the morning. Now here in this far east at 5 o'clock in the morning, it's dawn. It's daylight, but it's just starting. The British show up, and these are highly trained soldiers. Here we have Americans, basically farmers, citizen soldiers, not trained at all, and they don't know what to do because you've got 70 Americans facing 300 highly trained British. Right out here. At some point, somebody fired a shot. Nobody knows who. I was mentioning that there's a suspicion by some historians it could have been John Hancock or Sam Adams hiding behind a building someplace.
It might even be true because just because he writes in his journal that he heard the shot from far away doesn't mean that he wasn't here.
Right. Sam Adams had a vested interest in getting something started.
Well, and Sam Adams, give a little background about Sam Adams. He was a creative character from a little bit himself, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, he was one of my kids. I have his bobblehead at home. That's how much I like Sam Adams.
So tell them about Sam Adams.
Sam Adams was like the perpetual graduate student, a brilliant guy, but he never could hold down a job. At one time, he had collected taxes from the British. You know what he used to do with the taxes when he collected them? Put them in his pocket, go out later that day and drink and spend the money. Of course, he will get arrested by the British for embezzlement. He's going to go to prison until an American steps in, the richest man in America, a guy by the name of John Hancock, and says, you know, I like something about this guy Adams and the way he thinks. And so Hancock will provide the money for Adams' dream team to get out of, and he gets, his lawyers, and he gets out of trouble. From that point on, they become the odd couple, but, best of buddies. And they are the real instigators and beginners of the American Revolution, and they're largely forgotten. Mostly Sam Adams. And Sam Adams, by the way, was not a brewer. He did not brew beer. He inherited a brewery from his father, and as I told you, he was kind of an incompetent at almost everything except propaganda. He immediately ran that brewery into the ground. So Sam Adams was a big failure. But when I say he was like a perpetual graduate student, you guys don't know this going to a community college, but when I was an undergraduate, you probably saw it also, there were professors walking around, I thought. I found out later on, no, these were just grad students who were like 40, 50, 60 years old and never left college. And that was kind of like Sam Adams, just this frumpy, intelligent guy. What he found out when the problems started occurring between the British and the Americans, that he's really good at propaganda, that people like to listen to what he had to say. He will actually start up an organization of young men, teenage boys, called the Sons of Bitches. Liberty. Sons of Liberty, right. Sons of Liberty. They will become Sons of Bitches to the British. So Sam Adams is a big leader, so is John Hancock, and they were actually here the night before what happened out here in hiding. And we don't know if they left or if they fired the first shot or whatever, so I'll just throw that out for you. But anyway, about 5 o'clock in the morning, they're standing out here, 70 Americans, and there are going to be 300 British standing here. And at this point, I will just read you some of the excerpts so you get the exact. The first British troops to reach Lexington were an advance guard of light infantry under the command of Major Pitcairn. They approached Lexington at sunrise at 5 a.m. The same time Paul Revere was helping to hide Hancock's trunk. So Hancock did get out of town. A group of about 80 Lexington militiamen, I said 70, under the command of Captain Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, waited for the British to arrive. Parker understood that the militiamen were overmatched and decided not to try to detain the British. So they're standing out here.
They were just going to let them go.
The militia would, however, make a showing and then let the British pass. So it was saber rattling, basically. When the advance guard of British arrived, a British lieutenant called out for the militia to disperse, and according to some reports, and you may have heard this, he said, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels." So we don't know if that's historically accurate or not, but it's become part of the myth. Parker, the American, instead told his men to disperse and go home. But some may not have heard him, and they left slowly. But they all held on to their weapons. So the British now, and these young men, these British soldiers, many of them teenagers, they're scared too, even though they're trained, and they've got their fingers on their triggers. Nobody knows who fired the first shot, as neither Parker nor Pitcairn ordered their men to fire, but a shot was heard. That shot changed world history, didn't it? I contend that was the shot that was heard around the world. Okay, out at Concord, they want to say the first shot fired at Concord Bridge, but this happened earlier in the day. Under duress, the British commander, Colonel Smith, who was not here, finally managed to restore order when he got here. He permitted the British troops to fire a victory volley and then march to Concord. Okay, and he sent a message back to Boston saying, "We're going to need some reinforcements." Boy, are the British ever going to need reinforcements, because you're going to find out when we get to Concord Bridge a little later after we go to Minuteman Park what happened. But it takes the British about 2 hours now after the skirmish here to get to Concord. What happened here? 8 Americans will lie dead right out here. Another 10 are wounded. One British soldier gets a slight wound in his hand. Another British soldier gets shot, a teenage boy gets shot in the thigh. It's not life-threatening. And that's the first battle of the American Revolution. But it's too late to put the toothpaste back in the tube at this point. It's too late to put the genie back in the bottle.